Have you ever wished you could turn into something small and free, just for a moment, just to escape the weight of who you are? Sometimes love does that to a person. It shrinks pride, bends time, and makes even the strongest heart dream of wings. This is a story about distance, longing, and the quiet lies people tell themselves when love feels out of reach. It starts with tenderness, almost innocent, and slowly walks into rejection, judgment, and a painful misunderstanding of worth. You'll meet a man who carries his whole world inside a simple instrument, and a woman who believes status speaks louder than truth. But life has a funny way of flipping roles when we least expect it, doesn't it? So stay with me until the end, because what looks like weakness at first might be power in disguise. If this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You're going to want to hear what comes next. He used to say that if he were a bird, he wouldn't fly far, not across oceans or cities. He'd fly just enough to land gently where love felt safe, right in the curve of someone's arms. That fantasy wasn't about escape, it was about relief, about resting from the quiet pain he carried. Love, when distant, has this strange power to make ordinary people imagine impossible things. You see, when the heart gets tired, it doesn't ask for much, just warmth, just recognition. Anyone who has missed someone at night knows that feeling, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories. And that longing, subtle at first, was already planting the seeds of everything that would follow. He wasn't dramatic about his pain, at least not out loud. But inside, every thought circled back to the same wish, to be close, even briefly. Distance taught him that love doesn't fade quickly. It stretches, it aches, it tests patience. People say time heals, but time also amplifies silence when no answers come back. That's when the heart starts negotiating with itself, hoping, doubting, hoping again. He wondered if affection could survive without presence, without touch, without reassurance. And unknowingly, that question was already leading him toward a harsh lesson about appearances. There's an old saying that love never forgets, and he believed it deeply. Not because it sounded poetic, but because forgetting felt impossible for him. Every memory came back with details, the tone of voice, the pauses, the unspoken promises. Love from afar has a cruel habit of growing instead of shrinking. It turns small gestures into sacred symbols and absence into obsession. Anyone who's waited for a message that never came understands this quiet suffering. And still, he held on, unaware of how fragile hope can become. Sometimes, when love feels uncertain, the mind starts asking dangerous questions. Is there someone else? Was I ever enough? Did I imagine the connection? These doubts don't arrive loudly, they sneak in during ordinary moments. A walk home, a song on the radio, a silence that lasts too long. He didn't want to accuse, only to understand, to be told the truth. Clarity, even painful, often hurts less than endless guessing. That need for honesty would soon collide with something far more brutal than distance. He believed affection should be simple, honest, stripped of masks and status. But the world rarely works that way, especially when pride enters the room. Love, he thought, should recognize effort, intention, and character. Not clothes, not accents, not where someone comes from. Yet life enjoys testing ideals by placing them in uncomfortable situations. Moments that expose how quickly people judge without listening. And that test was about to arrive, disguised as an ordinary day. He carried his feelings quietly, the way some people carry faith. No grand speeches, no demands, just consistency and patience. That kind of love can look small from the outside. But inside, it grows roots, strong and stubborn. It waits, believing that truth eventually reveals itself. What he didn't know was how sharp rejection can feel when it comes unannounced. And that realization was waiting for him, inside an elevator, in a city that never slows down. He arrived in the city carrying the kind of silence only people from the countryside know well. The streets were louder than his thoughts, but his heart stayed calm, trained by distance and patience. That worn hat on his head wasn't fashion, it was history stitched with sweat and sun. The viola on his back wasn't decoration, it was memory, work, and identity in one shape. Cities like that don't notice men like him at first glance. They measure value by speed, shoes, and posture. Still, he stepped forward, unaware that judgment was already waiting inside an elevator. The doors slid open, and the space shrank into something intimate and uncomfortable. She walked in like she belonged there, polished, distant, wrapped in quiet superiority. In seconds, her eyes scanned him, cataloging flaws that only mattered to her. He noticed her beauty, yes, but also the invisible wall she carried with her. Despite that, he spoke, not boldly, just honestly, the way real men still do. Sometimes sincerity sounds out of place in modern rooms. And sometimes, it invites cruelty instead of kindness. His words weren't a proposal, they were an offering of presence. A simple sentence, warm, unprotected, carrying no expectations. Hope flickered briefly, like a match in the dark. But arrogance doesn't hesitate, it strikes fast and confidently. Her response came loaded with disdain, dressed as honesty. She didn't just reject him, she erased him. In her voice, he was already less than nothing. She called him outdated, poor, a mistake that wandered too far from his place. The viola became proof of failure, the hat a symbol of shame. In her world, dignity had a bank account and respect wore expensive fabric. She spoke as if life had chosen her and discarded him. That kind of cruelty feels casual to those who practice it daily. It's the cruelty of people who never had to prove anything. And those words landed heavier than the building's weight. He didn't react the way she expected, and that unsettled her. There was no anger, no embarrassment, no desperate defense. Just a quiet pause, the kind that makes people uncomfortable. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. And mirrors scare those who rely on illusion. He inhaled slowly, steady, as if grounding himself. Because truth, he knew, works best when delivered calmly. What she didn't understand was that she was standing on borrowed ground. The city loves disguises, and wealth often rents its confidence. Appearances are loud, but ownership is silent. The elevator kept rising, carrying more than just two people. It carried assumptions, pride, and an imminent reversal. Every floor added pressure to the moment. And soon, the truth would introduce itself without asking permission. He adjusted his posture slightly, not in defiance, but in certainty. Some people don't need to raise their voice to shift power. They simply state facts and let reality do the rest. The building hummed around them, unaware of what was unfolding. In that narrow space, masks were about to fall. And when they did, one of them would realize how fragile arrogance can be. The next words would change everything she thought she knew. He finally spoke again, but not to defend his pride or repair wounded ego. His tone stayed calm, almost gentle, the kind that disarms instead of attacks. He explained that the viola wasn't a burden, it was a calling he respected deeply. That worn hat wasn't poverty, it was a trophy earned under open skies. Some people confuse simplicity with failure because they've never lived without masks. He didn't accuse her, he didn't mock her certainty. He simply allowed truth to breathe in that small space. Then came the moment she wasn't prepared for. He mentioned the building casually, as if it barely mattered to him. Said he owned a few like this one, nothing fancy, just honest investments. Not as a boast, but as a correction, like adjusting a crooked picture frame. The words didn't rush, they landed slowly, one by one. Reality has a strange echo when it enters a room uninvited. And suddenly, the floor beneath her confidence felt unstable. He looked at her the same way as before, without resentment. No satisfaction, no revenge, just clarity settling into place. He explained that he walked these halls not to impress anyone. He was there for responsibility, not recognition. Rent was late, paperwork existed, duties mattered. Life, he implied, isn't a performance, it's an agreement. And she, without knowing, had broken hers. The shift was visible, subtle but undeniable. Her posture changed, her eyes searched for exits that didn't exist. Pride doesn't collapse loudly, it leaks out through small gestures. The same city that taught her to judge had failed to teach humility. In that moment, status felt thin, fragile, almost embarrassing. She realized respect can vanish as fast as it's assumed. And silence returned, heavier than before. He didn't press further, didn't lecture or punish. Some lessons don't need explanation to be understood. He adjusted his viola strap, grounded, unshaken. Men who know who they are don't need validation. They let others sit with their own conclusions. That restraint spoke louder than any insult could. And it forced her to confront the version of herself she avoided. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware of this quiet reckoning. People rushed, elevators climbed, lives crossed without meaning. But for her, something cracked permanently. The mirror had been placed in front of her without mercy. Not by cruelty, but by composure. Moments like that don't shout, they whisper truths you can't unhear. And that whisper would follow her long after the doors opened. As the elevator slowed, both stood changed in different ways. One grounded by truth, the other shaken by it. The space between them felt wider than the city itself. What began as judgment ended as exposure. But the real weight of that moment had yet to surface. Because some realizations don't hurt immediately. They wait, and grow heavier with time. When the elevator doors opened, the city rushed in like a flood that didn't care about inner storms. People stepped in and out, unaware that something irreversible had just taken place. She walked forward, but her body felt heavier than seconds before. Confidence doesn't disappear instantly, it fractures and sinks slowly. Every step echoed with the realization that her certainty had been built on assumptions. The words she had thrown so easily now followed her like shadows. And silence, once comfortable, had turned into an unbearable companion. Outside, the city lights reflected ambition, success, and appearances she once trusted. But now, those same lights felt artificial, almost mocking. She tried to remind herself who she thought she was. Yet that identity felt thinner with every breath. Pride had always protected her from doubt, until it didn't. Moments like that don't break you loudly, they unravel you quietly. And quiet unraveling is the hardest kind to stop. Meanwhile, he moved through the city unchanged on the surface, but lighter within. Not because he had won, but because truth had stood without resistance. He didn't replay the scene or savor her discomfort. Men shaped by distance and patience rarely seek validation. His strength came from consistency, not from proving points. The viola on his back reminded him of where he came from. Roots like his don't shake easily. Back in her apartment, comfort felt unfamiliar, almost borrowed. Walls once admired now whispered impermanence. She noticed details she had ignored before, the silence, the emptiness, the echo. For the first time, wealth didn't feel like safety. She realized status can disappear faster than respect. And respect, once lost internally, is hard to reclaim. That thought lingered longer than she expected. Sleep refused to come easily that night. Her mind replayed the encounter, searching for excuses, then abandoning them. She tried to justify her words, but they sounded cruel even in memory. Judgment had felt powerful, until humility stripped it bare. Sometimes life teaches without raising its voice. And those lessons leave marks no one else can see. She turned in bed, carrying a weight she couldn't name. He, on the other hand, found peace in routine. Paperwork, responsibilities, small rituals that grounded him. There's comfort in knowing exactly who you are. No disguise, no performance, no borrowed confidence. People like him measure wealth in freedom and self-respect. And that kind of wealth doesn't fluctuate. It stays, even when everything else shifts. Neither of them knew that silence was only the beginning. Unfinished lessons have a habit of returning. Life rarely delivers growth in a single encounter. What was planted in discomfort was still taking root. And roots, once formed, push their way back to the surface. Soon, paths would cross again, not by accident, but by necessity. Time passed the way it always does after uncomfortable truths, quietly, but not gently. Days moved forward, yet the memory refused to stay behind. For her, the encounter became a recurring thought, surfacing at unexpected moments. In elevators, in mirrors, in conversations that suddenly felt shallow. She began noticing how often people spoke before understanding. How quickly labels replaced curiosity. And slowly, uncomfortably, she recognized herself in those moments. She started paying attention to small things she once dismissed. The way service workers spoke when they weren't respected. The subtle difference between politeness and superiority. Things she had practiced unconsciously for years. Growth rarely announces itself as growth. It arrives disguised as discomfort. And discomfort, when faced honestly, becomes a teacher. She was learning, though she wouldn't admit it yet. Meanwhile, he continued living as he always had, grounded and deliberate. His days were filled with work, music, and quiet satisfaction. He didn't think of her often, but the moment lingered faintly. Not as resentment, but as confirmation of something he already knew. That dignity doesn't need applause to exist. That humility often reveals itself too late to those who ignore it. And that patience, when practiced long enough, brings clarity. Sometimes, while tuning his viola, he thought about distance differently. Not physical distance, but emotional and social distance. The kind built by assumptions and fear of difference. He had crossed those distances his whole life without knowing it. From countryside to city, from silence to misunderstanding. And he had learned that bridges aren't built with words alone. They require time, consistency, and restraint. For her, reflection slowly softened into regret. Not dramatic regret, but the quiet kind that questions habits. She wondered how many people she had misjudged before. How many stories she had ignored because they didn't fit her world. That realization didn't make her weak, it made her unsettled. And unsettled minds search for resolution, even when pride resists the idea. The city, indifferent as ever, continued offering chance encounters. People crossed paths daily without knowing their impact. But some encounters refuse to stay unfinished. They linger, waiting for timing to shift. She didn't know why, but she felt another meeting was inevitable. As if life had paused a conversation mid-sentence. And life rarely forgets to finish what it starts. Somewhere between reflection and routine, fate began aligning quietly. Not dramatically, not urgently, but deliberately. Paths that once crossed briefly began curving toward each other again. Growth demands witnesses, after all. And lessons unfinished demand revisits. Neither of them sensed it fully yet. But the city was already preparing their next meeting. The second time their paths crossed, it didn't feel accidental, even though it looked that way. The city has a habit of pretending coincidence when it's really repetition with purpose. She noticed him first this time, standing in a familiar hallway she once walked confidently through. There was no elevator now, no confined space to hide behind. Open space makes truth harder to avoid. Her heart reacted before her pride could organize a defense. And that reaction told her more than she wanted to admit. He recognized her a moment later, slower, without tension or expectation. Not all memories return with noise. Some arrive quietly, like a soft chord. He didn't change direction, didn't stiffen, didn't prepare a response. The past encounter had already completed its lesson for him. Men at peace don't carry rehearsed comebacks. They carry presence, and presence speaks on its own. That calm unsettled her more than any accusation would have. She hesitated, standing between who she had been and who she was becoming. Words gathered in her chest, heavy and unfamiliar. Apologies are easy to imagine and difficult to release. Especially when they threaten the image you once protected fiercely. She realized silence had once been her weapon. Now, silence felt like cowardice. And growth demanded something braver. Around them, the city moved on, uninterested in their private reckoning. Footsteps echoed, doors opened and closed, lives brushed past. No one noticed the weight suspended between them. But moments of real change rarely attract crowds. They happen quietly, in spaces without witnesses. That's where truth feels safest to surface. And truth was beginning to rise. She finally spoke, her voice softer than she remembered it being. There was no justification, no excuse wrapped in explanation. Just an acknowledgement of ignorance, delivered carefully. She admitted she had mistaken simplicity for weakness. That she had learned something uncomfortable about herself. Humility doesn't announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through restraint. He listened the same way he always had, without interruption. Some people listen to respond, others listen to understand. He belonged to the second kind. The apology didn't inflate him or restore something broken. It simply settled into the space between them. Acceptance, when sincere, doesn't require ceremony. It requires presence. As they stood there, something shifted quietly in both of them. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but recognition. Recognition that people change when life insists. That first impressions can lie. And that lessons repeated are meant to be completed. Neither of them said more than necessary. But both felt the weight of what still needed to unfold. After that second encounter, neither of them returned to life the same way. Something invisible had been placed between them, fragile and unresolved. They didn't exchange promises or polite goodbyes. Some moments don't need closure, they demand reflection. She walked away slower, aware that change had been initiated. He watched her leave without expectation, but not without awareness. Unfinished stories have a weight you can't ignore. For her, the days that followed felt suspended, as if time itself hesitated. She replayed the apology, wondering if it had been enough. Growth is uncomfortable because it removes familiar defenses. She realized humility doesn't erase the past, it confronts it. And confronting the past requires consistency, not a single gesture. She felt a pull toward something she once dismissed. Not attraction, understanding. He, meanwhile, found himself thinking more than usual. Not about her specifically, but about how life tests character quietly. How some lessons arrive dressed as conflict. He wondered if people truly change or simply adapt. Years on the road had taught him patience over expectation. Still, something about her reflection felt different this time. Different enough to make him pause. The city, relentless and neutral, continued weaving their paths closer. Small coincidences stacked quietly, like pieces of a pattern forming. They crossed streets minutes apart, shared familiar spaces unknowingly. Life rarely forces reunions loudly. It nudges, observes, and waits. Both felt that nudge, even if neither could explain it. Something was being prepared. She began listening differently to the world around her. Voices once ignored now carried stories. Simplicity, once mocked, now felt grounded and real. She noticed men like him everywhere, unnoticed, steady, dignified. And she wondered how many truths she had overlooked before. That curiosity unsettled her more than guilt. Curiosity invites transformation. He returned more often to his music, letting it speak what words didn't. The viola carried emotions without judgment. Music has a way of revealing truth without demanding answers. Each note held patience, resilience, and waiting. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Only that something wasn't finished yet. And endings, he knew, arrive in their own time. Neither of them realized how close the turning point truly was. Life had tested pride, then softened it. Now it prepared to test choice. Choice reveals who we become after learning. The final lesson wouldn't come through confrontation. It would arrive quietly, disguised as opportunity. And when it did, everything would finally make sense. Their final encounter didn't come with drama, music swelling, or perfect timing. It came quietly, like most truths that are meant to stay. They met again in a place that felt ordinary, stripped of symbols and status. No elevator, no crowd, no stage for pride to perform. Just two people standing where masks no longer made sense. Life had removed every excuse gently, one by one. What remained was choice, raw and unavoidable. She spoke first, not to explain, but to acknowledge. Not just the moment in the elevator, but the person she had been. She admitted how easy it was to confuse simplicity with lack of value. How comfort had blinded her to character. There was no self-pity in her voice, only clarity. Growth doesn't beg for forgiveness, it owns its mistakes. And ownership changes everything. He listened, as he always did, grounded and unshaken. Not because he felt superior, but because he felt complete. Some people don't need apologies to feel whole. They carry their worth like breath, naturally, without effort. He understood that her words weren't for him alone. They were for the version of herself she was leaving behind. And that mattered. For the first time, she didn't see a man with a viola. She saw discipline, patience, and history carried with pride. She saw a life built slowly, without shortcuts. And she realized how rare that kind of strength truly is. Not loud strength, not decorated strength, but steady strength, the kind that lasts. The kind people notice too late. He, in turn, saw something new in her as well. Not elegance, not status, but humility learning to walk. He knew humility isn't instant or perfect. It stumbles, questions itself, and grows quietly. Whether their paths would continue together didn't matter most. What mattered was recognition. And recognition had finally arrived. They didn't promise futures or rewrite the past. Some endings don't need romance to be complete. They need truth, respect, and understanding. Life isn't always about who stays. Sometimes it's about who learns. And sometimes, learning is the real victory. Both walked away lighter than before. If there was a lesson left hanging in the air, it was simple. Never underestimate what you don't understand. Never confuse noise with value. And never forget that dignity doesn't need approval to exist. Some people fly without wings. Some people carry worlds inside simple instruments. And some stories only make sense once we learn how to truly see. Stories like this don't really end when the last scene fades. They linger, because they touch something personal we rarely talk about. How many times have we judged someone too quickly, based on surface details? How many times have we underestimated a life we didn't understand? This story isn't just about him or her, it's about moments we've all lived in different ways. Moments where pride spoke louder than empathy. Moments where silence taught more than words ever could. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you looked, where you came from, or what you carried with you? Or maybe you were on the other side once, and only later realized it? Which part of this story hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. Your experience might resonate with someone else reading. And while you're there, suggest a song you love. Who knows? It might become our next story. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, emotional, human, and inspired by real music, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. New stories are waiting, and the next one might feel even closer to home.